Kenya and Tanzania. The north of Kenya is one of the most remote environments on Earth. The land is formed out of the volcanic rock of Mount Marsabit and surrounded by the bare and salty Chelby Desert. Very little vegetation can withstand the hostile environment, so the surroundings are red rock, desert, and little else. I was lacking energy from the sickness of Yabello, but was still determined to get back on the bike. Nate cycled with me, and we passed the time by discussing the various sexual merits of our fellow riders. We agreed that until now, desire had been pretty much off the agenda, but that something in us had started to stir, and there were a few attractive bodies walking around to keep us entertained. On the side of the road, men swept sand away from the concrete. In the dry, arid wind, it was as unforgiving a task as I'd ever seen. The first settlement we reached was Marsabit. It was a frontier town with a sandy main street and groups of men in bars checking out the strangers who'd appeared out of the desert. In our lycra jerseys singing Ghost by Ella Henderson, we were the gayest two amigos in town. We spent the night camping at a convent outside of the centre. The nuns were savvy to the needs of Western visitors and laid out a feast of biscuits, chocolate bars and ice cream, all for £1 each. That new statue of the Virgin Mary isn't going to pay for itself, said Nate. The next day, the landscape changed again. We climbed up the sides of Mount Marsabit, and the temperature dropped. This gave rise to green foliage, lakes, rain, and even elephants hidden in the bush. We cycled along mud tracks and through remote villages, watched over by Maasai tribesmen and women on the roadside. Here was another vision of the Africa of my imagination, and I was as excited as if I'd encountered a gorilla riding a giraffe. I asked one of the Maasai women if I could take a photo. She agreed, then asked me to give her £5 for the privilege. This was obviously not the first time a tourist had been through here. Coming from the UK, I had clear expectations of Kenya. Lions and elephants, savannah plains, Maasai tribes, cities full of slums. Before now, I'd barely had any preconceptions on the trip. What to accept as Sudan, of Zambia. But Kenya was an archetype, the nation that represented the Africa of my childhood imagination. I paid the Maasai woman and took a photo. Then I focused on the road ahead. It didn't take long for my preconceptions to be confounded once again. Out of the jungle, a mountain appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a sandstone stack like those in Ethiopia, rather a grand snowy peak like the Matterhorn or Mont Blanc. Here, situated in the middle of green farmlands, was Mount Kenya, the second largest mountain in Africa, rising alone with vast craggy peaks iced with snow. The Maasai gave it the name God's Throne, and its appearance was suitably deified and unforgettable. Nate and I stopped for a picnic lunch in the foothills of the mountain. We ate cheese sandwiches, drank local Tusker beer, and discussed plans for the forthcoming cross-dressing party that was planned for the equator. "I never dressed in drag before," I said. "Any tips?" Nate considered the tight turquoise blue dress that I picked up from a local market. "Don't forget to cross your legs when you're sitting down," he suggested. We descended from Mount Kenya and reached the equator. There wasn't much there, aside from a sign, and a few shops selling tourist junk. We cycled to our hotel campsite and prepared for the cross-dressing party. Nate looked pretty attractive in a gold-fringed bolero top and tight faux leather pants, while I looked like Margaret Thatcher in my dress. Most of the other cyclists joined the fun, and we spent the evening downing beers and throwing shapes to Lady Gaga and Taylor Swift. Late at night, Nate and I retired to the campsite, lay down together, and looked up at the stars. The moon was directly above and was surrounded by a circle of clouds. It was like the universe was spinning around us. Do the clouds revolve like that because we're at the equator? I asked Nate. I think it's just because you're drunk, he said. The next day, we began a long, flat slog towards Nairobi. The landscape became urbanised with bizarre old colonial towns, tea shops, public schools, and vast retail estates. Cycling became more precarious by the mile. I've been warned of many dangers in Kenya: Al-Shabaab terrorists, AK-47 wielding bandits, lions and leopards. But as with most places in the world, the number one danger to cyclists were cars. Cycling along the main highway into Nairobi was a constant game of Russian roulette, with cars happy to drive on the other side of the road and head straight at you whenever it took their fancy. I went to take a photo of one such incident, stupidly, and managed to lose control and crash off the side of the road at high speed. I fell onto my side and lacerated my elbow. It bled a lot. Nate was on hand and formed a makeshift bandage, and more importantly, after a little straightening out, the Duchess was okay to continue riding. At lunch, our nurse, Jodie, gave the cut a clean, applied a strong plaster, and gave me the okay to keep going, on the proviso I had stitches at camp. Only in Africa. In Nairobi, we camped in a field next to a shopping mall, and as luck would have it, there was a private hospital on top of it. The mall was a place for white people to do their shopping outside of the dangers of the city, and as such, even healthcare was provided. The nurse gave me some stitches, wrapped my arm up in plaster, and prescribed me a week's worth of antibiotics. My bill was in American dollars, rather than the local currency. After this, I took a quick afternoon to explore the city, but compared to Addis, it felt much more westernised, with office blocks, fast food restaurants, and traffic jams, as well as some vast shanty towns. With Western money came Western inequality. Nate spent the time meeting local LGBT activists and discussing their lives under the Anti-Sodomy Act, a relic of the colonial era. Suddenly, the wound on my arm did not feel like so much of a big deal. The entrance to Tanzania was another moment out of the Africa textbook. Zebras grazed by the side of the road. Maasai farmers led cattle across the fields. Mount Kilimanjaro sat on one side, Mount Meru the other. There was even a paved road for our enjoyment. It was cycling paradise. We had our passports stamped, stopped at the busy city of Arusha, and set up camp in the grounds of a hotel. There was now a 3-day rest to explore the wonders of northern Tanzania, and I was keen to make the most of it. Nate and I took a safari on the Serengeti. Although it was a shame to be off the bikes, as we crossed into the national park, it felt like we had been transported into Eden. Lions, elephants, giraffes, cheetahs, wildebeests, golden sunsets and grassy plains stretching out to infinity. The experience was like nothing else on Earth. We camped in the national park, the sounds of crickets and the occasional hyena echoing through the darkness. I was woken up in the middle of the night by an elephant wandering around our campsite. The true African experience. In the morning I woke up and noticed a strange swelling on my foot. It wasn't painful, but it was purple and made me feel woozy. I speculated as to whether it might be tsetse flies and I could have sleeping sickness, or it might be a mosquito and I could have malaria. I told our guide, who laughed into his coffee and told me to stop being a stupid white man. I agreed with him and thought nothing more of it. Tanzania was beautiful, but also had pockets of serious deprivation. Cycling out from the national parks, we noticed the first signs of true poverty. Families begged for food on the roadside, and locals gathered to scavenge leftovers when we stopped for lunch. In one village, there was a dead body on the side of the road. It seemed crazy, given all the rich tourists hovering around the Serengeti and the Masai Mara, but as always, the wealth did not go directly to the people. I learnt that 2/3 of the population lived below the poverty line, with 32% deemed as malnourished. Tanzania was also where the AIDS problem in Africa really started, with over 20% of the population infected, and the number growing by the year. The paved road we were cycling on may have provided economic benefits, but it was also the cause of the spread of the disease throughout rural areas. I had no doubt it was the reason for the roadside corpse. Soon we turned off the highway and started a long slog on a dirt road that would lead us straight to the Malawi border. Nate and I cycled together and chatted to keep ourselves sane. Our conversations ranged from the philosophical, is one day on the tour the same as a month in the real world, and what does that mean? The whimsical, why don't women find the idea of two men having sex as alluring as men find two women having sex? And the salacious, did you see the Canadian rider sneaking off to the tent with our driver? And aren't they both married? Alongside us, farms and villages gave way to tropical forests and cloudless skies, presenting vivid contrasts of blue, green and deep orange. It felt like we were cycling through a surrealist painting, the Chirico landscape, where everything was rendered still, aside from the spinning of our wheels. The long dirt road was a meditative place to cycle. Without any distractions, we were able to take our time, interact with the people around us, and drink in the beauty of our surroundings. Weaver birds built vast nests in the trees. Fish eagles hovered above the canopy. Occasionally a snake slid over the road. Children in well-kept uniforms walked in long lines to school. Villagers played football long into the evening, interrupted occasionally by cattle running onto the pitch. After one game, there was an impromptu dance competition, and we joined in with gusto, causing much laughter with our unfamiliar moves, such as big fish, little fish, and the Macarena. The strange purple swelling in my foot had expanded and turned into a mixture of purple and bright red flesh. One lunchtime I took my sock off and asked Jodie if she could have a look. She drew a line around the swelling with a Sharpie pen. "Does it feel hot?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "Everything feels hot." She frowned and prodded it with her finger. Does it hurt? She asked. I don't know, I said. Everything hurts. She rolled her eyes. You're not being much help. Another of the riders, a doctor from Alaska named Mark, came over to have a look. He was a lugubrious individual, for whom every day seemed like a greater descent into a wallow of misery than the last, and I was not looking forward to his prognosis. What do you think? Asked Jodie. It's getting quite infected. Mark knelt down and closely inspected the swelling. Did it start here? He said, wrapping his hand around my ankle. Yes. And how long has it taken to move here? I don't know, about a week? He stroked the swollen red skin around my shin. I don't like the look of this, Jodie. Do you have a large hypodermic needle? I can pick one up at the next border crossing. It might be wise. I chose not to think about what this meant. The dirt road ended, and we began a long climb out of the Great Rift Valley. On the way up a winding mountain road, we passed a vast quarry, manned by Chinese workers and machinery. Dug into the side of the mountain, it resembled a scene from a James Bond movie. Workers in jumpsuits, large drills, piles of rubble, barbed wire, and aggressive signs telling us to stay away. Nate and I cycled by gingerly, trying not to make eye contact. Upwards was our only means of escape, and we were not going anywhere fast. We reached the summit and took a long look at the land beneath us. Tanzania was a panorama of colour, green, blue, splashings of red and orange. Over the mountain lay Lake Malawi and the warm heart of Africa. We cycled on.